This is GPS, the Global Public Square. Welcome to all of you in the United States and around the world. I'm Zakaria. We'll begin today's show with the dashing and energetic 41-year-old Prime Minister of Italy, Matteo Renzi. An exclusive interview on the migrant crisis that is threatening to tear Europe apart, on the ISIS terror threat, and on the comparisons between Donald Trump and Silvio Berlusconi.
I consider Donald Trump a man who invests a lot in a policy of fear.
Also looking at the migrant crisis from another nation's point of view. Lebanon's education minister explains how his nation of 4 million is dealing with a refugee population of 2 million. Imagine 170 million people coming into America in just 2 years, he says. And with each new terror attack, people have begun to ask again that question. Why do they hate us?
Tomorrow will be Washington. It will be New York. It is coming.
Why do some Muslims seek the death and destruction of the West? That's a question I'll ask and answer in my latest special, premiering Monday at 9 p.m. I'll give you a sneak preview this hour. But first, here's my take. Should the United States cut off its ties to Saudi Arabia? That is the question of the week that emerges amidst a swirl of controversies and President Obama's recent visit to the kingdom. Now, I've been a critic of Saudi Arabia for decades, but with all the problems, I think that the United States is better off with the alliance than without. Let me be clear. I believe that Saudi Arabia bears significant responsibility for the spread of a cruel, intolerant, and backward extremist interpretation of Islam, one that feeds directly into jihadi thinking. But as the scholar Gregory Gause points out in an important essay forthcoming in Foreign Affairs, Saudi Arabia lost control over the global extremist movement in the 1980s. The Saudi regime itself has been targeted by that movement since the 1990s. If America was target number 1 for Al-Qaeda, Saudi Arabia was target number 2. Well, in the 1950s, Saudi Arabia's Wahhabi version of Islam, a product of nomadic desert culture, was practiced by a tiny minority of Muslims. Saudi Arabia makes up 1% of Muslims worldwide, roundabout. Then came the oil boom, and Saudi Arabia, its government, charities, and people spread these ideas throughout the Muslim world. This globalized Wahhabism has destroyed much of the diversity within Islam, snuffing out liberal and pluralistic interpretations of the religion in favor of an arid, intolerant one. In the 1980s, as the war in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union turned into a religious conflict, doctrines of jihad flourished. In many cases, Islamic fundamentalism turned into Islamic terrorism. In the years that followed 9/11, after much defensiveness and denials, the Saudis began to reverse course, shutting down government funding for Islamic extremist movements. Retired U.S. General David Petraeus once told me that the most significant strategic shift during his time in uniform was that Saudi Arabia went from being a tacit supporter to an aggressive foe of jihadi groups. Today, Saudi intelligence is a major ally in fighting Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and its ilk. And yet, Saudi funding of Islamic extremism has not ended, and its pernicious effects can be seen from Pakistan to Indonesia. The funds now come from individuals, not the government. Still, it is hard to imagine that the absolutist monarchy of Saudi Arabia cannot turn off the pipeline of money to extremists. The reason probably is that Saudi Arabia is reluctant to take on its religious extremists for fear of backlash. Hardline preachers and ideologues have significant sway in Saudi society. The kingdom is well known for its vast and growing social media. Less well known is that within that social media, the biggest stars are Wahhabi preachers and extremist ideologues. Were the Saudi monarchy to fall, it might not be replaced by a group of liberals and Democrats, but rather by Islamists and reactionaries. And having watched this movie in Iraq, Egypt, Libya, and Syria, I'm somewhat cautious about cavalierly destabilizing a regime that is, at the end of the day, in many areas, defense, foreign policy, oil, finance, a stable ally. Saudi Arabia has created a monster in the world of Islam, and it is now a Frankenstein's monster, one that threatens Saudi Arabia as much as the West. The kingdom must reform itself and its export of ideology. But the reality is that this is far more likely if America engages with Riyadh rather than distancing itself, leaving the kingdom to fester in its own world. Foreign policy often means dealing with the world as it is, not as you would wish it to be. It means foregoing the satisfaction of some grand moral victory and accepting instead small quarter measures. In few cases is this more true than in America's relations with this strange desert kingdom. For more, go to cnn.com/Fareed and read my Washington Post column this week. And let's get started. Joining me now in the studio is Prime Minister of Italy, Matteo Renzi. He's in New York this week, along with many other world leaders, to officially sign the climate agreement reached in December. Welcome back to the show, Mr. Prime Minister.
Thank you so much.
Italy has now become the new entry point, it seems, for all these waves of migration that are coming into Europe. Of course, it has always been, but for a while, Greece was the central entry point. That seems to have been shut down, slowed down. You saw this tragedy of this boat this week. What is the solution to this immediate crisis, which is these waves of refugees? Where will they go? What happens to them? Are you going to have camps to keep them?
There is not solution in the next 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months. We need a strategy. We need a very intelligent program for the next months, and only Europe could solve this very great problem. Because for me, the real question is not tackle against the people who arrive with the ships in our borders. The real question is blocked these sisters and brothers who come from Africa and give them an opportunity in Africa. So,
meaning find something in the places that they're migrating from, so that they don't have to migrate.
Absolutely, we haven't alternatives.
But what do you do in Syria? These people can't go back to Syria.
We need time. First, block the war, block the causes of migration. In Syria, finally, we achieve a very important first step of peace. It's not the definitive solution, but it's a very important step.
But do you have time? Because you're getting these waves of migrants, and it's changing the politics in countries like Italy, like France.
Yes. Now we have a very great controversial situation in Europe. A lot of countries said, this is the time of new walls. We block the people, we build new walls. I think this is not the solution. This is a good for consensus, but I think I prefer lose some point in consensus in the polls, but don't lose my dignity. Italy continue to save the people in the sea. Because also if my opposition consider this a mistake, I think it's absolutely important to maintain my dimension of human being. If there is a woman in the Mediterranean who risked the life, I save this woman. I try to save these people. Obviously, maybe I lose some point in the polls, but I don't lose my dignity, and this is very important.
What about the other issue of the climate of fear, which is the terrorist attacks that have taken place in Europe? Over the last year, you have had a series of terrorist attacks in Europe, and many people say that one of the problems that Europe faces is that its countries, while they are all part of the European Economic Union, they do not share intelligence. They do not have the same standards on borders. Somebody comes into one country and he's a suspicious person, that is not then reported to other countries. how serious is a problem is this? Because there are people who say Europe will fall apart because of this, because countries will start putting up borders rather than accept the idea that they just have to let in somebody from Greece or Bulgaria.
I agree with you, Farid, about the intelligence sharing, absolutely. And this is a problem for some countries in Europe. But first of all, let me be very frank. First, there is not a connection between migration and terrorism. Terrorists come not with the ships. Terrorists, in part, come with the very strong organization and in part grew up in Europe.
They grew up in Europe?
Absolutely. Molenbeek, a part of Brussels, is a part in which a lot of these killers grow up. And this is a problem for Europe. So, in Italy, we changed legislation. I put on the table a lot of money to fight against terrorism. But at the same time, I give this message. For every euro invested in security, we must invest €1 in culture, education. For every euro invested in police, we must invest €1 in a different cultural approach, because when you see some colleagues who said, okay, this is a time of war, I think this is not correct. This is not war. This is terrorist attacks inside Europe, but we need a reaction also in the education system, in the cultural system. Security starts from education. There is also a problem in Syria against Daesh. We must destroy the army of Daesh everywhere. We fight against these terrible people everywhere with the United States of America. But at the same time, I think Europe, Brussels, we have a problem. And the problem is in Europe, not only outside.
Mr. Prime Minister, we need to take a break. When we come back, I will ask the Prime Minister about the comparisons between Donald Trump and Silvio Berlusconi. What can we learn from Italy's experience? And we are back with the Prime Minister of Italy, Matteo Renzi. So, Mr. Prime Minister, I wonder, when you come to this country and you see that there is a very rich man, a billionaire, who is appealing to people at a very populist level and is very funny and is able to make jokes and laugh, and nobody thought he was going to do well, and then suddenly he does better and better and better. Are you watching Donald Trump and thinking to yourself, I've seen this movie before and his name is Silvio Berlusconi?
Every country presents a different history. And I respect American people, and so I think it's better for a Prime Minister of Italy don't enter in a competition, electoral competition in USA. This is my personal position and the official position of the government. As member of my party, Democrat Party, obviously I support very strongly Hillary Clinton, because I think she's a woman able to give security to every partner, to give a message of cooperation with other parties, to continue the good policy of President Obama. Our experience with a billionaire as prime minister is very complicated. I consider Donald Trump a man who invests a lot in a policy of fear. He uses expression about migration, or about Muslims, or about also relation with European people. So, I don't know. I respect, as Prime Minister of Italy, I will host every president of the United States of America in the next G7 in Italy in 2017. I respect the vote of American people, the Republican Party, the Democrat Party, Independent Party, everything. We respect because we consider American people as brother people, and our first ally, our first partner, our first friend. At the same time, as a member of a party, of Democrat Party in Italy, I hope the next president of the United States could be a woman, finally.
But let me ask you, as an Italian politician, there are many politicians, political figures in Italy who feel that Berlusconi, in many ways, set back Italian democracy because of the extraordinary use of his private power and mixing it with public power, turning the celebrity status into political status. Do you worry about Trump in that way?
I'm not worried. I'm not worried. I don't agree with Donald Trump positions, but at the same time, I consider American democracy as a model for the rest of the world, also for Italy. And so I'm not worried. The American people will be able to decide about the next president in freedom and in respect of everyone.
Will you miss President Obama?
Everyone in Europe consider the Obama presidency as a great presidency. Obama changed a lot of things in the United States for labor market reforms, for the economy after the terrible crisis of 2008, for a lot of for attention about climate change, energy sector, universe, a lot of things in your country. But I think Obama gave also a great message around the world. And personally, I consider good, positive legacies by Barack Obama, the agreement in Cuba, and also the agreement in Iran. I visited last week Iran, I visited Tehran, I met President Rouhani. I think the decision to involve Iran in a new strategy for the area, but also for the rest of the world, it's good. Obviously, we must control, we must verify the respect of the agreement, but I think President Obama will be, this part, a legacy of President Obama will be very, very good in the judge of the future.
Mr. Prime Minister, pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Next up, as Prime Minister Renzi says, the refugee crisis has no short-term solution. But imagine being a top official in a country whose population has gone up 50% because of the influx of refugees. How in the world do you manage that? Find out when we come back. The waves of the Mediterranean wash up on the shores of Lebanon. But from the nation's inland borders with Israel and Syria, it is waves of human beings that have been washing up, waves of refugees. These refugees have been coming for decades, but now Lebanon seems to be at its breaking point as it tries to figure out how in the world to feed these people, keep them healthy, and educate the children. The challenge is astounding, as are the numbers involved. Listen in to my conversation with the nation's education minister, Elias Bousab. Elias Bousab, pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much.
So explain, it strikes me you have one of the most difficult jobs in the world. So Lebanon is a country of 4 million people?
That's correct.
How many refugees does Lebanon have from the Syrian civil war?
You know, we had 500,000 Palestinians from before, and now we have 1.5 million Syrian displaced people and are now present in Lebanon.
So there are 2 million refugees for a country of 4 million people.
They're exactly that. So it's like as if you are comparing to the United States, about 170 million refugees decided to walk into the country in less than 2 years.
And when you look at this problem, you are looking at it from the point of view of the Ministry of Education. What became your principal challenge once you have these 1.5 million people come into the country?
I have 1,200 schools in the government system. I have 250,000 Lebanese school age in the system, in the government system, and I have 450,000 Syrian refugee child ready to go to school.
So you have almost twice as many refugee children as there are in the entire public school system in Lebanon.
Exactly. So I had to think outside the box. First thing we tried to do, to look at a case study, to see where did this happen in the world, how can we learn from what happened to deal with the situation. And you will not find anything like that. You know, Lebanon, according to the UNHCR's report, is the highest per capita country that have displaced people. Actually, they've listed like the top 10. Lebanon alone, put together all the other nine, Lebanon alone is double the figure.
Wow.
So we are in a situation that is unheard of in the world.
So what is your plan?
I started operating double shift system. I used the school twice, one shift in the morning and another shift in the afternoon.
Like a factory almost.
Like a factory almost.
How did you get double the number of teachers, or did you make teachers do double shifts?
We do have a lot of part-timers, adjunct professors. Because of the unemployment rate is so high, we have a lot more teachers than what we need, and they do 3 or 4 hours a week. The problem was with the funding. You know, the Lebanese government's financial situation is known to the world. You know, we have big debts, unbalanced budgets. We had the crisis prior to the refugees situation. Still, Lebanon opened its doors to all these refugees. They are there. And we went to the international community and said, we need funding to be able to make a difference. We need funding. We are committed to put all these children in schools. We are committed to give them health care. We are committed to take care of them on a temporary, solution until the situation in Syria permits, until there is a political solution in Syria where they can go back, where they can safely go back home.
And what happens, in your view, when these children are not in school? Many of these are teenage boys. This is the easiest recruiting ground for groups like ISIS, Hezbollah, groups like that.
Well, usually they're ISIS, because Hezbollah is Lebanese group and they have nothing to do with this. But in the ISIS, anytime you have children out of school, they are, they get abused for either child labor, easy recruit for the terrorist organizations like ISIS and Nusra and others. You have child prostitution, you have early marriages, you name it. Everything becomes, even crime rate goes up in the country.
And with all your work, you've only got half the kids, right? There are about 450,000 school-age kids, and you've managed to find your plan can take care of 200,000.
Right.
So even if you succeed and get fully funded, now you have to double it.
Right. We have a plan to take all 450,000 by the end of the academic year 2016-2017. However, this will depend on the financing. But right now we are at a point where, we need to help. We are human beings. It is an obligation. I myself was a refugee one day in Syria for a year, and I lost a school year when during the
Lebanese Civil War.
1982, during the Israeli invasion to Beirut, to Lebanon. We had to flee the country. So I understand what it means when you leave your country and go somewhere else. And I thought we need to help.
Elias Poussab, pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much.
Next on GPS, the United States is under attack from China. In fact, China attacks the United States every day, not with fighter jets or missiles, but with ones and zeros. And the United States attacks right back. We will take you deep inside international cyber wars when we come back. What do Ronald Reagan, Matthew Broderick, and the People's Liberation Army Unit 61398 have in common? Well, quite a bit, actually. It all relates to the rather frightening reality the world finds itself in right now. A reality where nations are attacking other nations on a daily basis, not with conventional weapons, but computers. The most troubling part is there are no rules, no laws, no way to stop this from spiraling into real war. Slate's Fred Kaplan has been digging into all of this for a great new book, Dark Territory, The Secret History of Cyber War. Listen in on our conversation. Fred Kaplan, welcome.
Thank you.
So you say this all began when Ronald Reagan was watching a Matthew Broderick movie.
That's right. It's an odd story, but it's the first weekend in June 1983. He's up in Camp David on one of his 5-day weekends watching a movie every night. On Saturday, he watched War Games. Remember, this was Matthew Broderick. He plays this tech whiz teenager who unwittingly hacks into the main computer at NORAD, and thinking he's playing a computer game, unwittingly almost sets off World War III. So the following Wednesday, Reagan is back in the White House. There's a big national security meeting, not about this, something else. But he can't get this movie out of his mind. At one point, he puts down his index cards and says, has anybody seen this movie War Games? Well, it had just come out. Nobody's seen it. He launches into this very detailed plot description. People are looking around, rolling their eyeballs, And then he turns to his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and says, General, could something like this really happen? says, well, I'll look into that, Mr. President. And he comes back a week later and says, Mr. President, the problem is much worse than you think, which led 10 months later to the first presidential directive on computer security, which reads remarkably like the things that you read all the time now. You know, our computers are coming under, they're vulnerable to electronic interference from terrorists, criminals, foreign agents.
But
Right.
what we hear about a lot now is how vulnerable the United States is, how there are all these attacks coming in from the Chinese, from Russian hackers, how our nuclear facilities may not be safe. What's the scenario that you worry about?
Well, you know, I guess I'm not really quite clear on why, for example, China or Russia would want to shut down the lights in New York City, even to gain leverage in a conflict over the South China Sea, which is a common scenario.
Right.
But what if terrorists all of a sudden start getting this stuff? Or they get enough money to pay people who know how to do it, and they just want to wreak havoc.
And shutting down the power grid strikes you as something that's kind of doable and would have devastating consequences.
They couldn't do it over the entire country or even over the entirety of a region because we are decentralized to some degree. But yeah, they could shut down, say, the eastern seaboard for a fair amount of time. It's not at all out of the question.
What do you make of the numbers you hear about Chinese hacking, that, you know, the Pentagon gets hacked? I don't remember the numbers, a million times a day or whatever
it's
it
a lot.
is.
But it works.
And it's mostly Chinese.
Chinese, Russia, a little bit our friends. We do the same thing to them. You know, you don't hear about it as much. We don't hack into their banks or get
But
their
Fred,
trade
do you
secrets. We
understand?
don't need it. We don't need it.
We are virtuous. And
Well, we don't need to know the design of their airplanes. They stole it from us in the first place. But we hack into their military networks. We have plants in their critical infrastructure just as a deterrent. If it's just that to their attacking our critical, we're all wrapped up in each other's systems.
You know, it strikes me that this resembles a little bit the early days of the development of nuclear weapons, where, you know, everybody had this new stuff. It seemed pretty amazing and powerful, and there were no rules about it. And then you got arms control because people realized this thing can get out of hand. Is there any prospect that there would be some kind of arms control-like agreements where the Chinese and the Americans say, come up with a set of rules that say, look, we both understand we each do it, but here's what here are the lines we shouldn't cross?
There's been talks about this, but you know, right now there are 20 countries that have cyber units in their military. And maybe we could strike some kind of deal with the Russians and the Chinese and the French and the Israelis. But what about the Syrians and the Iranians and the North Koreans? And I could go on and on. How do you bring them into a concert of Vienna of the cyber age? It may have gotten out of hand a bit too quickly.
Fred Kaplan, pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Next up, Islamic jihadis the world over have great expectations about the 72 virgins that will be waiting for them in paradise. But my next guest will tell you that it's all a big misunderstanding, probably a mistranslation. The jihadis will be sorely disappointed. We'll tell you the story when we come back. Donald Trump says Islam hates us. But does it? Certainly some Muslims do. How many? And why? And what in the world can we do about it? My team and I have been hard at work preparing my next special, which seeks to answer these questions. It's called Why They Hate Us, and it's premiering on Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern on both CNN and CNN International. One of the people I interviewed for the program is a woman with an extraordinary story, Irshad Manji. One imam said that Manji was more dangerous than Osama bin Laden. Why? Because she's a Muslim reformer who's trying to change her faith from within. A vocal, feminist, reform-minded gay Muslim. Listen in to Manji's fascinating tale. Talk about growing up in Vancouver in a Muslim household and going to a madrasa.
Well, my family and I are refugees from Idi Amin's Uganda. And we wound up on the precious soil of Canada in 1972. And that's where I grew up, attending two kinds of schools, Monday through Friday, the public school, and then every Saturday for several hours at a stretch, the madrasa. And that is where I began to ask, very simple questions. But those questions, including why can't Muslims take Jews and Christians as friends, angered my madrasa teacher. And at one point, at the age of 14, he said to me, look, either you believe or you get out. And if you get out for good. And I stood up and I walked out of the madrasa. And indeed, what I did every Saturday, now that I was no longer welcome at the madrasa and had 8 hours, to work with, I went to a secular institution called the Public Library, where I read everything I could about belief systems. And that, Fareed, is where I also discovered something that revolutionized my faith. I discovered that Islam has its own tradition of independent thinking and debate and dissent and reinterpretation. And it's a tradition known as ijtihad. And what is so ironic, if not sad, is that I would have never learned about it at the religious school. A secular institution saved my faith in my faith.
What was it like when you realized that you were gay and had to try to reconcile that with your faith?
I really haven't struggled. And my lack of struggle about being a gay Muslim really comes from the fact that I have deep faith in God. And this is not a God whom I fear. It is a God whom I love, and I believe loves me back. And what I find so ironic is that, even mainstream Muslims, especially mainstream Muslims, say that Allah is omniscient and omnipotent. He cannot make mistakes. He knows what he is doing. Great. Well, in that case, he knew that he was creating somebody like me. Did he make a mistake in doing so? Farida, I'm not saying I'm right. I'm saying let's have the humility to leave the final judgment to God himself.
You say it's very important not to sanitize Islam. Explain what you mean.
Well, I mean that moderate Muslims have a tendency to sanitize Islam. So, for example, the next time a bombing or beheading occurs, and God knows it will, the first thing you will hear from the mouth of a so-called moderate Muslim is, oh, no, please don't misunderstand. Islam has nothing to do with this. That's simply not true. Because most of the people doing these bombings and beheadings say that they're doing it in the name of Allah. And they actually cite verses from the Quran. So, here's the thing. Religious symbolism does play a role that moderates are still not willing to own up to. Reformists own up to it, but we also acknowledge that Islam is being manipulated. It is being used. And that is why we are coming to the table as reformists with bold and competing reinterpretations of the Quran. And reinterpreting, I want to emphasize, is not the same thing as rewriting. It is rethinking the meanings of the words that already exist.
And to those who say, well, you are cherry picking, what do you say?
I say, yes, that's correct. And so are you, by not acknowledging the freedom-loving verses of the Quran. And so let us have diversity of interpretation within Islam. I could be wrong. You could be wrong. Maybe we'll both see each other in hell. Who knows? We won't know until we meet our Maker.
You make a point that I feel not enough people are aware of. So one of the most famous points about Islam that you will hear across popular media everywhere is that the Quran promises a martyr in the name of Islam, 72 virgins. Is that true?
It is not true. Nowhere in the Quran does it promise 72 virgins, 70 virgins, 48 virgins. What it promises, as far as heaven goes, is something lush. And, there was a few years back a controversy over a scholar who came to the conclusion that the Arabic word for virgin has been mistranslated. That the original word that was used in the Quran was the word for raisin. not virgin. In other words, that martyrs would get raisins in heaven, not virgins. And some would laugh out loud saying, how in the heck could this be possible? Why raisins? Well, remember, in the 7th century, the desert of what is now Saudi Arabia would have been a place that is dry enough that something like a raisin would have been pricey and would have been a heavenly delicacy. So it is entirely possible that the Quran has been mistranslated to give this impression of virgins being delivered to martyrs in heaven. I don't buy it, and there's nothing in the Quran that suggests 72, that's for sure.
Don't miss my new special, Why They Hate Us, on Monday night at 9 p.m. We'll introduce you to radicals and reformers, angry Muslim activists, and angry American politicians. We'll dig into how Islam got to this point and how many Muslims are there out there who want to kill us. Monday night at 9. Next on GPS, a refreshing pause from the coverage of the campaign trail today. In a moment, an intimate portrait of a past occupant of the Oval Office, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. President Obama is in Hanover, Germany this Sunday, the first visit of a U.S. president to that city. It follows a trip to Saudi Arabia and the United Kingdom, and it brings me to my question. Who was the first sitting U.S. president to visit Germany? Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Harry Truman, or Dwight Eisenhower? Stay tuned and we'll tell you the correct answer. This week's Book of the Week is actually a set of films on DVD. It begins with a unique glimpse inside a presidential campaign. But don't worry, I'm giving you a break from the 2016 circus. The collection is called The Kennedy Films of Robert Drew and Associates, and the films are a first-hand look at 1960s politics from the primaries to the presidency.
You are about to see a candidate's view of this frantic process.
Using what was then revolutionary handheld camera gear, the documentaries provide a real fly-on-the-wall experience. First, we see then-Senator John F. Kennedy challenge his Minnesota colleague Hubert Humphrey in the 1960 Wisconsin primary.
Senator Humphrey just stopping by to say hello. You betcha.
The film allowed real-life moments to unfold in front of the cameras, telling the story without interviews and with little narration, a radical departure from the documentaries of the day. The finished product is said to have impressed the future President Kennedy, who later allowed the crew to film him in the highest office in the land.
Now you will begin to move with the president.
In one fascinating hour, the camera's eyes watch JFK working with his brother, then Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, and Bobby's deputy, Nick Katzenbach. The trio is trying to skillfully navigate the politics of the 1963 desegregation of the University of Alabama in the face of the obstinate Governor George Wallace.
Well, I believe that separation is good for the Negro citizen and the white citizens.
And the viewer is privy to all sides.
Now, the governor cannot block all those classes.
If he still doesn't move, then we'll try to get by him. Pushing? So we're pushing a little bit.
The films will be available on Blu-ray and DVD from the Criterion Collection on Tuesday. They will likely make you nostalgic for an era of politics where the rhetoric was less like this.
I mean, first of all, this guy's a joke artist and this guy's a liar.
And more like this.
When the cause of freedom is endangered all over the world, when the United States stands as the only sentry at the gate, when we can see the campfires of the enemy burning on distant hills, that's what's at issue today. That's what we are attempting to determine in the coming months and years, all of us.
The correct answer to the GPS challenge question is C. Harry Truman was the first sitting U.S. president to visit Germany when he attended the Potsdam Peace Conference in 1945. Richard Nixon was the first president to go to Saudi Arabia in '74 in the wake of the oil crisis. As for Britain, Woodrow Wilson made the first visit of a U.S. president to the UK, arriving in London on Boxing Day in 1918 after the armistice that ended World War I. Thanks to all of you for being part of my program this week. I will see you next week.